This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. The number of measles cases continues to grow in the U.S. This month, there have been more than 1,200 cases in 31 states, including Connecticut. The CDC says it's the greatest number of measles cases since 1992. Coming up, Connecticut Public reporter Nicole Leonard joins us with an update just 1 week after Connecticut released vaccination data about public school students. First, an investigation by Hearst, Connecticut media looked into sexual harassment complaints in the workplace and found it's a pervasive problem. The series came out this month, the same month that a new state law went into effect to prevent harassment in the workplace and protect victims. Joining me now to tell us more about the series into workplace sexual harassment and abuse is one of the reporters on the series, Caitlin Krasselt, who's a political reporter for Hearst, Connecticut media. Caitlin, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I want to also tell our listeners they can join into the conversation as well. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. As always, find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Caitlin, we know that sexual harassment in the workplace has really gotten a lot of attention in the last couple of years, specifically because of high-profile cases. So I'm curious what made you look into this on a local level.
Yeah, so that was actually kind of the impetus for this series. We know all of these high-profile cases, the Harvey Weinstein case in particular kind of kicked off this Me Too movement in 2017. But we know that sexual harassment and abuse is not just limited to Hollywood and the halls of Congress. We know that it affects men and women every day in normal workplaces, and that often we don't hear those stories because they aren't high-profile people who the media would normally write about. So we wanted to understand how often this does happen and, any sort of trends associated with that, what types of industries this might occur in, what size of workplace, is it more common some places than others? And what we found is that there isn't really a trend. As far as industries, yes, restaurant and hospitality had a little bit higher incidence rate just because of the nature of the work. But for the most part, it's across all industries in all types of workplaces. And that was really what we wanted to understand and kind of put a face to something that we had a hunch was happening just because we knew anecdotally, but we wanted to really understand it better.
Coming up, we're going to hear from the Executive Director of the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities, Tanya Hughes. This was a state agency that Hearst, Connecticut media, that's where you got your data looking into complaints filed against employers. So tell us a little bit about that process and how far back did you look?
We filed a Freedom of Information request in February. For the previous, any complaint with the CHRO that had an allegation of sexual harassment going back 5 years. We chose 5 years because it was just a nice round number. You kind of have to pick one. And it happened to be that there were 100 complaints involving sexual harassment over the last 5 years.
And this was a five-part series. Before we hear about some of the cases that you and your colleague Emily Munson reported on, I am curious when we talk about sexual harassment and abuse, it can be, problematic to identify people who are, so-called victims of this behavior, these assaults. And so tell us a little bit more about the process of deciding to identify some of the women in these stories.
Yeah, we went through a lot of kind of ethical discussions about this. All of their names are included in the CHRO complaint, so we know their names, and anyone who chose to, go through that Freedom of Information process could find them out. And a lot of them are in public court documents and that kind of thing. But most people don't go through that, and so we chose not to identify anyone that we didn't speak to directly, and we did offer anonymity to anyone who was willing to share their story with us, and there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that many of these cases settle with a confidential settlement, and identifying them would jeopardize their settlement, the terms of their settlement agreement. And another reason is that for some of these women, it would jeopardize their safety, and we don't want to do that either. And for others, we do know that women who come forward, there's a little black mark next to their name when they're looking for new employment, and so they felt safer not being identified. And then we also had a couple of women who were more than willing to be fully identified, to use their full name and to use let us photograph them and that kind of thing. We also had a debate about naming the accused. And that was something that was kind of interesting to work through with Emily and our editor, John Ferraro. The accused are also named in these documents. And so it's a fine line between determining, there's a legal parameter and then there's also an ethical parameter in terms of, is it fair to name them? Because anytime you Google them, they'll come up. But we did, in a couple of instances, decide to name them. Those allegations were substantiated unrefutably, and so we did name them as well.
We're talking about workplace sexual harassment and abuse. Again, Hearst, Connecticut media reported on a series this month, a 5-part series. Caitlin Kresselt is one of the reporters on that project, looking into this issue across the state of Connecticut. You can join our conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Caitlin, walk us through some of the stories that you profiled, these specific cases. One that really stood out to me was a woman who was harassed who worked for the Connecticut judicial branch.
Yeah, that story was just so particularly shocking to me. And not shocking in the way that I was surprised that it happened, but that I was surprised that it happened and the response was so inadequate within the judicial branch, which is the system ultimately that is designed to protect people. So Lynn Mealy and her daughter, Jessica Bianco, both worked for the Connecticut Judicial Branch. And Lynn was harassed for the better part of a decade. And when someone finally overheard her kind of try to stand up for herself, she finally told someone about what had been going on. And she had been receiving these just horrible text messages that were so inappropriate. She never once, responded in a way to make her employer think that they were appropriate, her supervisor. And so she finally did file a complaint with Judicial Human Resources. And through a couple-month investigation, the Internal Human Resources Department for the judicial branch found without a doubt that there was quid pro quo sexual harassment, that he had solicited sexual favors in exchange for a promotion and had been sending her inappropriate text messages for years. And their response to that was to transfer him to another office where he, to this day, my understanding, is still employed.
Mm. You said that these were two women that both worked for the judicial branch. So they no longer work for the state?
Lynn still works there in the same position, and her daughter, Jessica, who just happened to be transferred into the same office. It had nothing to do with the fact that they were related. She ended up leaving her position with the state because she didn't like going to work there anymore.
Did you find that is common among the cases that you looked at, that people who are reporting harassment, whatever nature it is, that they end up leaving and the accuser or the accused ends up still remaining on the job?
Yeah, absolutely. Whether it's by their own choice or not, which we did find as well in 28 of the 100 cases that we looked at, the victim was terminated for coming forward, which is just such a heartbreaking statistic. And in many, many, many other cases, the women chose to leave on their own volition because they didn't want to work in the same space as the person that had harassed them. They were no longer comfortable coming to work. They, in most of the cases, it said, the victim had no choice but to leave. And that is, and that kind of gets to the heart of this series, right? These are just regular people who often don't have the privilege to go without work. They need these jobs. It's not like they have other things to fall back on. So leaving a job because of this is really difficult.
And in this particular case, the male supervisor you mentioned was transferred. What did the judicial branch say about how it was handled when you contacted them?
So so she ended up suing the state of Connecticut in federal court, and that case was just settled, and the settlement was just released last week. So they actually haven't offered any sort of comment on why they responded the way they did because it was tied up in a federal lawsuit. So I'm hoping to hear back on that soon.
There was another case that you reported on, a woman, I believe we're just using her first name, Laura, who
Laura.
worked at Northwestern Mutual. What happened to her?
So she was at a conference with one of her, I believe he was a colleague, not necessarily a superior, and he, there was like a happy hour type of thing one day after the conference, and he ended up sexually assaulting her when she tried to help him get back to his room late one night. And she kind of suppressed that and, went back home and kind of ignored it. And then when she went into her office the following Monday, he was there and it all came flooding back to her. And she was like, I have to complain because this was so traumatic.
Mm. Yeah. You said that she suppressed it. Oftentimes we hear when someone deals with harassment or a sexual assault that they feel like it's their fault. Was that something that Laura, that went through her mind?
Yeah, I think they had been intimate once before by choice, but she did not want to do it again. And just because you did it once doesn't mean you have to do it again. And so I think a lot of women go through that, what could I have done differently? In another case, a woman who worked in a janitorial position was let go, and she was, she felt really bad about herself because she was like, this is a job that anyone could do and I'm getting fired from it. And of course she was getting fired because she complained about harassment, not because she wasn't good at the job.
So in the instance of Laura, this male colleague, he broke terms of the rules spelled out by this private company, but what happened to him?
I believe he still works there. And that is the case in so many of these cases of harassment. The male, sometimes the harassment is carried out by a woman. It's not always men that are harassing. But the harasser typically remains in their position. They are not usually the one transferred. That's usually offered to the victim, which, could hurt their career. And it's just more traumatic that way. And I think that in only 2 of the 100 cases, the man was terminated. And in just a handful more, they were transferred or had some other sort of repercussion.
How did what happened to Laura also show that, again, we're going to be talking about Time's Up, this new state law that just went into effect this month. But prior to that, depending on where you worked and how your company, maybe they had HR or not, that the way these situations are handled, they vary across the board.
Yeah, they do vary across the board. And, one of the things that is really great about this new law is that it extends training to almost every single person that works in Connecticut, whereas previously it was limited to supervisors and managers at companies, I think, of like 15 people or more. And now it's every employee, every supervisor at companies of 3 people or more. So that's effectively training every person in Connecticut about what they should do if they're harassed, what is appropriate workplace behavior. And so the idea is to prevent people like Laura from having to go through this and not knowing what to do.
As you detail in the story, it was Laura's supervisor that tried to handle the situation, not HR?
Yeah. That's another thing was so weird about that case. And she essentially was forced to confront her harasser, and she kind of went through this really bizarre series of events and ended up, I believe that was the case where she filed the CHRO complaint on her own. And then, it was just a very complicated series of events that followed from there.
Again, Caitlin Kresselt is in the studio with me, political reporter for Hearst, Connecticut Media, one of the reporters on this 5-part series looking into workplace harassment and abuse across Connecticut. You can join our conversation. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Something you said earlier, that when we look across all of these industries in Connecticut, in the food hospitality sector, you see a lot more of these complaints. One of the people that you profiled was Jasmine Bass, who worked at a New Haven KFC. What happened to her?
She had worked at the New Haven KFC for only about a month when she had 2 supervisors, a man and a woman. They sent her a sex tape and, essentially said something along the lines of, in case you want to join us, so you know what's going to happen. And Emily, my colleague, reviewed the tape. She's seen it, and it is true. And so then she felt so uncomfortable going to work. She tried to complain, and what happened to her is that she was just left off the schedule there, which is another form of retaliation. You're not necessarily fired, but your shifts are cut, which prevents you from earning a paycheck, and it just kind of spirals from there.
What else about the culture from your reporting did you begin to understand in terms of when we look at the restaurant and hospitality sector? Is there a belief that there will always be other people that are willing to take this job, oftentimes minimum wage? So if someone complains, they get canned.
Yeah, I think that is part of the problem as well. There are always people willing to do that kind of work because even though it is minimum wage, in some places it can be lucrative. And in the places that it's not lucrative, it's a job that a lot of low-income people they need, and it's easy to get. But it's not that easy to keep. And, part of the problem in the restaurant industry is it's not just coworkers, it's also customers. There's this kind of idea that the customer is always right, and women especially are encouraged in a lot of restaurants to wear more revealing clothing to increase their tips, and that kind of perpetuates this culture of harassment in the restaurant and hospitality industry.
Before we head to break, I just wanted to stress again, these were 100 complaints that you and your colleagues reviewed because they had gotten to the level where they were reported to the state agency, again, the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. But do you feel from your reporting that people are aware that this is the process, that there's a state agency that can help?
No. And I would say, too, we reviewed 100 complaints, and we know that this is just the tip of the iceberg because these complaints are ones where someone did know the next step after they were dissatisfied with their employer response. And that's typically when a complaint would elevate to the CHRO. If you complain and then are satisfied with the response by your employer, you wouldn't complain to CHRO, and then we wouldn't know about that. And then on top of that, I even know personally, in my personal life, people who have been harassed at work and went through the human resources process and were dissatisfied with it and then thought that that was just the end and that there was nothing that they could do. And so, again, that is the hope of this Time's Up law, is that everyone in the state will be trained so that if you are dissatisfied, you do know where to turn.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest today, Caitlin Kressel, political reporter for Hearst, Connecticut Media, as we talk about an important series Caitlin and her colleagues reported on, including Emily Munson, about workplace sexual harassment and abuse in our state. After the break, we'll be joined by the executive director of the state agency that investigates discrimination, and we want to hear from you. Have you experienced harassment in the workplace? Did you know where to turn? Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. How pervasive is workplace sexual harassment and abuse in our state? A Hearst, Connecticut Media series finds it's a problem across many industries in Connecticut. The series also finds that people who reported their harassers experienced retaliation in 52% of the cases filed with the state agency tasked with investigating discrimination complaints. That state agency, again, is the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. Its executive director joins us now in studio, Tanya Hughes. Welcome to the show, Tanya.
Thank you.
I should also mention Caitlin Kressel is still here with us, political reporter for Hearst, Connecticut Media, one of the reporters on this 5-part series about workplace harassment and abuse. So, Tanya, I had asked before the break to Caitlin if a lot of people know about CHRO and your responsibilities. So tell us how long you've been at the agency, and for state residents, what you're tasked doing.
Okay. I am currently the executive director, but I started with CHRO 25 years ago as a staff attorney, and I was promoted within to regional manager. I served in that role for about 16 years, and I've been executive director now 6 years. And my role is really to oversee the entire agency, but our agency is tasked with eliminating discrimination in the state of Connecticut through enforcement of employment, housing, public accommodation, or credit types of complaints, as well as overviewing our affirmative action programs in the state of Connecticut and monitoring our state set-aside program. So sexual harassment comes into play with respect to our processing of investigations of complaints.
That sounds like a big job. How big is your staff?
We have a very small staff with a very large responsibility. We currently have about 72 employees on staff with 4 regional offices. We have our central office, which encompasses our legal department, our executive office, our affirmative action unit, and our contract compliance and housing divisions. And then we have the 4 regional offices in Bridgeport, Waterbury, Norwich, and then in the capital region as well, here in Hartford.
For someone who's listening now who may be experiencing harassment in the workplace, what is the process that he or she should start? And then how do you get involved, Tanya?
Well, typically I don't personally get involved at this level unless the complaint has gone through every single stage of the complaint and they've exhausted all of the internal appeals. But basically, a complainant can call any of our regional offices, or they can call an 800 number, and they'll be provided with the information to contact someone and come in and actually sit down with an intake specialist who will assist them with filing a complaint. The complaint would have to be filed within a statutory time period, and so this new sexual harassment development is enhancing our ability to expand the time frames for all discrimination complaints.
That's the Time's Up law that just went into effect.
Correct.
So depending on when someone files the complaint, there's a longer period of time to investigate that? Or explain
Correct.
that for us. Okay.
Correct. So as of October 1st, if you are alleging that an incident occurred after October 1st of 2019, then you will have 300 days to file a complaint. Previously, or up until October 1, you only have 180 days. So if the incident occurred September 30th, you still only have 180 days. But if it occurred after October 1, you now have 300 days. And that's important because oftentimes people are fearful to come forward. They're very hesitant. They need to speak to family members, et cetera, and build up their confidence to come forward because oftentimes people aren't believed. They don't think they have enough evidence. And so we do quite a bit of outreach on our regional levels, as well as we have our Deputy Director, Cheryl Sharp, who heads a division of our Business Training Institute. And so we're willing to go out to businesses, schools, all types of agencies, and tailor any type of training.
So just to clarify for someone listening, if they are being harassed in the workplace, their first step is to contact their HR person within the particular employer, the company that they work for. If that isn't resolved, then they can file a complaint with the state CHRO?
Correct. If they feel like they're being harassed, the first thing they should do is to ask the harasser to stop. Then they should probably look over the company policies, if any exist, or speak with their supervisor or manager. If they have a union, they can go to their union representative. But they certainly are welcome to file a complaint with CHRO.
I guess the tricky part is if someone is being harassed by their supervisor or manager, what do they do then, Tanya?
Well, again, they can document it. They can ask the manager to stop. We're so grateful for this new law because it requires all employees to be provided information about what the law is and what is prohibited. And so this way, now they're armed with that information and they can recognize it when it happens. Previously, people would be exposed to certain types of behavior. People talk about sex in the office, or either there may be posters of people scantily dressed or something like that, and they may not be aware that that's something that's prohibited. So this law now enables them to know that it's prohibited, and they can speak up and speak out about it. And our process is free, and so, anyone can file a complaint as long as, they work for an employer that has at least 3 employees on staff.
Tanya Hughes is with us, Executive Director of the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. Also in studio, Caitlin Krassel, a political reporter for Hearst Connecticut Media. You can join our conversation, especially if you have a question about this new state law. We're going to talk more about the requirements in that law coming up at the number 888-720-9677. Also, if you've experienced sexual harassment, did you know where to turn? You can join us as well. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Caitlin, we heard Tanya Hughes mention that one of the requirements in this new law is giving victims, so to speak, more time after an incident happens to file a complaint and work through that process. But were there instances where before it got expanded from 180 days to 300 where you talked to women who were, unfortunately, they came forward too late?
I didn't speak directly to any women who came forward too late, but we do know from reading through the complaints that there were at least a couple of cases that had to be dismissed because they were filed after the deadline to submit them. And one of the cases that we wrote about, the woman ended up filing her complaint twice, the first time on her own and then the second time with the help of an attorney. And that second time she filed it, I think, just 2 days before the deadline. And then there's another deadline that isn't really talked about. But in that particular case, when she filed her first complaint and by herself without an attorney, she withdrew it to go through the legal system. And she didn't know when she did that, it started the clock on a 90-day timeline to file a case in court. So there are multiple sets of timelines that victims have to be aware of that I think in many cases they probably aren't.
Tanya Hughes, again, the Executive Director of the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities, CHRO. We're talking about this especially after the Me Too movement and the reporting that Hearst Connecticut media did that found that it looked like a number of the complaints that were filed actually grew substantially after the Me Too movement. Do you see that as, you can draw a parallel with the fact there's a lot of attention on what is and is not acceptable in the workplace?
Absolutely. Just from the time the Me Too movement started, we started getting a large number of inquiries and calls into our office. Not all were substantiated into actual complaints, but I even personally received calls from, there was one elderly woman who had been retired for over 10 years, but she spoke to me for over an hour at length with, tears through tears, just relating her experience in the workplace and how it resonated with her regarding why was she the one that was targeted. She didn't think she had done anything to encourage that behavior. She was a single mother, newly divorced. She just needed her job to support her family, and someone just harassed her daily in the hallways, and she just felt like she couldn't complain about it because it was someone in a supervisory capacity. So even since the article that Caitlin and Emily wrote, I've received personal calls at home, calls in the office. We've received over close to 4,000 registrations to our online training since October 1. It's just getting a lot of attention, and so we're so happy that, the attention is giving people, the confidence to come forward with their complaint.
You can join our conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Brian's calling from Middlefield. Brian, you're on the show.
Hi, thank you. I have a question for your guest. I understand that it is rather difficult to successfully file a claim and actually to get it into the court system. I wonder if your guest could tell us about what percentage of complaints that go into their office successfully make it through and are deemed viable claims in the court system, and maybe talk a bit about what happens to those claims after they leave her office.
Thank you, Brian. Tanya Hughes.
I personally don't follow the complaints after they leave our office. We have our complaints that go through our regional level, and then I would say probably 30% of those go forward, are found cause perhaps, and then of those that are found cause, they go to our public hearing stage, and then it's a whole new investigative process. So I don't follow the cases into the court level, so I wouldn't have the percentages on hand.
I am curious, when we hear that a case, there's a settlement reached, what does that mean? Does that mean that the employer has to show that they're doing better with training? Because in one instance, we were talking earlier with Caitlin, there was definitely evidence this person was harassed for many years, and the person accused ended up just getting transferred and still has a job.
Right, and that's part of the new laws that, the person that has been victimized will not be the one that has to make the changes. Other types of remedies available would be back pay if they lost any type of pay as the result of it. Caitlin had mentioned that some people were terminated. Maybe they get reinstated, or if they get front pay to cover them until they find another job. They may get attorney's fees or costs. There could be cease and desist orders. There could be emotional distress damages, but we also try to make the person whole and eliminate the circumstances that existed. So policies being put into place would certainly be part of the remedy.
This new state law, again, October 1st, the Time's Up Act, requiring several things that we've discussed, some of them. What are some other parts of this law that are important to stress, Tanya?
Okay. It's important to know that now the law is available to employers with 3 or more employees. Previously, it was only required to provide training to the supervisory personnel only, and only in those employers of 50 or more employees. So now they're required to provide information to all employees. They're required to post it in the workplace. They're required to provide training to all employees, and that must be within 6 months of their start date. And then they must also provide periodic supplemental training, not less than every 10 years.
And then outside of workplace harassment, there is a part that relates to the statute of limitations for sexual assault cases, Tanya?
Yes.
Increasing the statute of limitations for rape cases?
Correct. I haven't followed that part because that's the criminal aspect, and we don't cover that. But yes, that's correct.
Caitlin Kressel, remind us, this is not the first time, again, this Time's Up was before the state legislature. Can you remind us what some of the concerns were about this new law? I know the Business and Industry Association, CBIA, had some concerns, as well as Black and Hispanic lawmakers.
Yeah, there were concerns. One direction that maybe it didn't even do enough, even though it does pretty broadly expand the state's workplace discrimination laws far more than any time in the past 10 years at least. And then there were concerns that it was overstepping as well. So you saw that on both sides of it.
Tanya, do you think that this law will have the effect that lawmakers intend? Because we all know that while there is now mandated sexual harassment training for most employers in the state of Connecticut, some people might shrug their shoulders and say, well, what's wrong if I make this kind of joke? Or is this really harassment? Is this rise to a cause for concern that someone should be either transferred or terminated because of something that they say?
Right, and that's why this new law and this new attention is so important, because those are types of incidents that create what we call a hostile work environment. And so when it's happening on a constant and daily basis, then it's intolerable and it should not exist. And so by requiring employers to make certain that all employees know that this is not acceptable, most times it will also put attention and emphasis on the employer to create those types of policies and procedures in their workplace that are standard, and then make certain that they're consistently applied. That's usually the problem, is that they may have the policies, but everyone doesn't know that they exist or they're not consistently applied. And so now they're required not only to have these policies in place, but to also reinforce them and reinforce the training on a regular basis.
I'd asked you earlier about staffing levels. You said even since this 5-part series came out from Hearst, Connecticut media, you're getting calls and people are reaching out to you because of situations they've experienced. Do you have enough staff to follow up with these
We
cases?
never have enough staff. We were grateful, though, that we were able to get a couple of new positions out of this. And so we will be hiring a new attorney and a new investigator very soon to cover the additional duties and responsibilities that will come. We're already seeing that have come with this task. We were already required to put up the online training, 2-hour training, and that was to be provided at no cost to employers and employees. And so we successfully were able to get that up in time. And we've had, as of this morning, 3,877 hits to the training.
Caitlin Krasseld, again, with Hearst, Connecticut Media. You've spoken, and your colleagues as well, to many people the last few months looking at this issue of workplace sexual harassment and abuse. When they were able to take it to the state CHRO, what was their reaction to how the process unfolded? Any gaps that exist that they told you about?
There was a mix of people. Some people were very satisfied with that process, and others, were discouraged by the length of time that it took and wanted more of a legal route, went through the court system. So it really just depended on what their personal situation was and what their employer response was. And then the staffing is a challenge, I know, with the CHRO. So that time frame for them.
Before we go to break, Tanya, for listeners who want to learn more about or just to contact you if they have an issue, where can they go? Is there a phone number you can give us?
Absolutely. They can contact us at 860-541-3400. And if they listen to the prompts, there's a special designation for sexual harassment complaints that we put up recently. They also can go to our website at www.ct.gov/CHRO, and we have all of the information posted up there as well.
And Caitlin, your takeaways from reporting on this series and from what you've heard since it's been published?
I have received emails from people since this has been published saying, thank you for writing this. This happened to me too, and me too. And I didn't know where to turn. And so that is encouraging. The hope is that, with all of our stories, we did run kind of some supplemental information boxes on how the process works and what resources are available. And since the Me Too movement has started, things like the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund has started, which helps low-income women and victims of sexual harassment access attorneys. So, I think we've just heard the most remarkable stories, and the fact that these people continue to work is good.
A couple years ago, Where We Live, we did a show about sexual harassment that media professionals, specifically women, face in our industry, whether it's people we're interviewing or male managers. And so and we're seeing that play out now with NBC and how they've handled the Matt Lauer allegations. So again, this is something that all industries face. And so we will be continuing to follow this issue. And we really thank you, Caitlin Krasseld, you and Emily Munson, as well as Hearst, Connecticut Media, for doing this series and for coming on the show today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Also, Tanya Hughes, Executive Director of the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. Tanya, thanks.
Thanks for having me.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we're going to shift our focus to the latest measles case reported in Connecticut. This comes as lawmakers debate certain vaccination exemptions for public school students. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, the new tax law that went into effect in 2017 actually created a new initiative called the Opportunity Zones Program. It's to spur investment in the nation's most distressed communities. We're going to talk more about that program on Where We Live tomorrow, looking at 72 opportunity zones here in Connecticut and what's being done to attract investors to those regions. That's tomorrow. Now, today, we're just going to shift our focus now away from workplace sexual harassment to measles. That's because the number of measles cases continues to grow in the U.S. This month, there have been more than 1,200 cases in 31 states, including Connecticut. The CDC says it's the greatest number of measles cases since 1992. Joining me now in studio is Connecticut Public's health reporter, Nicole Leonard, with an update just 1 week after Connecticut released vaccination data about public school students. Nicole, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Lucy.
So not good news. We now know there's a fourth confirmed case of measles in Connecticut. What can you tell us?
Yeah, it's not good news. The Department of Public Health just announced last week that there was a new case of measles. So the other three were earlier this year, and so now we just saw one. And it occurred in Fairfield County. And the thing with this case is the first case this year among a school-age child. So the three previous cases were in adults. So this is the first case in a child. They said that this child got in early October, but we don't know any other details. We don't know where the child goes to school or if it's a boy or a girl. They're keeping those details for now.
If I were a parent of a school student in Fairfield County, I'd be really distressed hearing about this. Was the child infectious while in the classroom?
Yes. Well, what we do know, the big thing that is good to know is that they did a public health investigation, and they did determine that the child was not infectious while at school. So that's good news, and that should help lessen the worries of parents who may have a child in school in Fairfield County.
We've heard a lot about measles outbreaks, especially near in New York State as well as in Oregon. Tell us again, for many of us who aren't seeing measles these days, that's a good thing. But what does this disease do? How does it manifest?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people haven't seen measles because actually back in 2000, it was announced that it had been eliminated in the United States. It had been eradicated. Since then, though, the last couple of years, we've seen quite a number of cases. And like you just mentioned, over 1,200 this year. Measles is really trademarked by this reddish, brownish rash that usually typically starts at the hairline and moves down the body. And that's kind of the trademark of measles. But it's usually before you see a rash, sometimes a lot of people get fever, runny nose, watery eyes. So a lot of symptoms that mimic a cold or the flu. But it is followed by that rash, and it's a very distinctive rash. And it is very contagious.
You mentioned that in 2000 it was eradicated from this country. That's because of a vaccine, that vaccine being developed in the 60s. You spoke to Matthew Carter, who's an epidemiologist with the State Department of Public Health. Let's hear what he told you.
There were 3 to 4 million people in the United States infected every year before the vaccine became available in 1963. And among those who were reported, there were 400 to 500 people who died.
So that's, again, really startling to hear how it was a real issue before the vaccine. He mentioned that there are cases where people can die from measles.
Yeah, so what you just heard from him, about 400 to 500 people every year died before the vaccine really became widespread. But the, death still is a rare complication, I would say, among measles cases. More of the common ones are people did survive, but some of the people that did get measles that did survive, they suffered things like pneumonia or encephalitis, which is swelling of the brain, which can lead to actually some children could become deaf that way after surviving measles. So there are some serious risks and complications for having measles. It's not just, like having a cold and then getting over it. It can be very serious.
Nicole Leonard's with me in studio, health reporter for Connecticut Public, as we learn more about this fourth confirmed case of measles in Connecticut. Again, this is the first time this year this case is reported in a child. The other 3 were adults. Nicole, where were they in the state?
Yeah, the 3 adults earlier this year were in New Haven County. 2 of them got diagnosed. They knew each other in January. And the last case that Connecticut saw was in, I believe, March, in a person that had recently visited Brooklyn, New York, around the time that area was having a major outbreak of measles in community. So they, Department of Public Health, determined that person had gotten measles from that area.
You've actually been spending a lot of your time and your beat talking about vaccinations because of this debate about the state releasing school-by-school information. That actually just happened a week ago. What did we learn from that information, Nicole?
What we learned, the good news is we learned that most schools and most children in Connecticut are vaccinated for most diseases, including measles, mumps, and rubella, the MMR vaccine. So that's good news. The issue is looking at the data that was released last week. It was for the 2018-2019 school year. And when comparing it to just 1 year, school year before, they found that there are more schools now dropping below this 95% vaccinated level. So there are more schools in Connecticut. There were more schools in Connecticut last year who didn't have 95% of their children vaccinated for things like measles, mumps, and rubella.
That percentage is important because it relates to herd immunity. What do health officials tell us about that?
So the CDC says that schools and communities should have 95% of its people in that community or school vaccinated in order to achieve herd immunity. So that's a level of protection that significantly reduces the risk of disease outbreak in that community or school. And you got to remember that for the percentage of people who aren't vaccinated, that could be because they are medically compromised. They may not be able to get vaccines. The elderly are still more at risk. Pregnant women are still more at risk. And young babies, they don't actually they can't get the MMR vaccine until they're over a year old. So they're completely at risk for getting something, and they are not eligible to get the vaccine yet.
State public health officials are also concerned, including some lawmakers, because this data is showing that more schools are falling below that 95% vaccination threshold that you mentioned, 134 schools. And these officials are tying that to the rising number of parents that are opting for religious exemptions to these mandatory vaccines. So what's going to happen in the next few months with lawmakers coming back to session? Will this be coming up?
This will definitely be coming up. I can't say exactly what will happen, but we just have seen in the last several weeks and months going back that people like Governor Ned Lamont, now DPH Commissioner Renee Coleman Mitchell, including fairly large number of Democratic legislators do want to and support the idea of eliminating the religious exemption to mandatory vaccines, which would only leave a medical exemption. And those are particularly, those only occur in specific circumstances. Children usually have doctors sign off on things to say that they cannot get these vaccinations. So we would be following in the footsteps, if it happened, other states that have done. Nearby states, New York and Maine, have already done this, eliminated their non-medical exemptions.
That call to eliminate religious exemptions does not please all Connecticut residents. Some parents not happy with this. What are their concerns if this is rolled back?
Yeah, a lot of there's a group. I shouldn't say, there are groups of parents who are against mandatory vaccination. So some of them are against all vaccinations. Some of them are partially, they just don't want to have to mandatorily do it. So they are pretty upset. They've been very outspoken against eliminating something like religious vaccination. Some people are worried that if that exemption was eliminated, that their child would not be able to go to public school anymore, and that they would have to figure out different ways to get their children education. So those are some of the concerns among that group. They have been very vocal, but we'll see how this plays out during the next legislative session.
Nicole Leonard is Connecticut Public's ace health reporter who often comes on our show. We thank you again for that update, Nicole.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Today's show produced by Carmen Baskoff. Thanks to Kevin Morrison on the phones. Our technical producer is Kyone Wolf. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. As always, thanks for listening.